What's going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. One thing that is abundantly clear is that there is a lot of variation at the top level of Infinite on these stock deck lists. So, what we're going to do for a couple of these lists is talk about the stock deck lists and then talk about other packages that can be used in those lists as well. The starting point, as always, I think for the last few weeks, is a Athena Angela deck, which the nerf to Angela did not do enough damage to, although it was fairly appreciable damage. I do think this is still probably the best deck in the game, or very close to it, but it is a lot more vulnerable than it otherwise was to Ravonna Renslayer. With Angela not really getting as big reliably, and your draws being so dependent on Kitty Pryde to get your Athena to a reasonable level, you end up leaning pretty hard on Ravonna Iron Man, and of course Mysterio into Mockingbird and Sasquatch. That ends up being a pretty big and important piece of what you're doing in terms of the power you're putting on the board, and that means that you're a little bit more vulnerable to Mobius because your game plan when you get Mobius just simply isn't as good after the Angela nerf. Now, that's not to say that this deck is any real amount worse, but I do want to sort of head off a criticism that I'm sure I'm going to hear a lot of, which is they nerfed Angela instead of nerfing Ravonna, which is the real problem in the deck. I am sort of the opinion that if you nerfed Ravonna, there would just be some other thing going on here. When you want to look at quote unquote the real problem in the deck, I would think that it's probably something closer to Mockingbird and Athena than it is everything else. Those are the cards that stick out to me as like the drastically overtuned ones. And as such, actually, Mysterio ends up being like a really big problem because of what he enables from Mockingbird, from Sasquatch, things like that. I do not think that Ravonna is necessarily what makes this deck go. I think people are looking at the Ravonna deck from previous metas, which is doing great things with Professor X, and saying, oh, it was a problem then, it's a problem now because it's doing stuff with Iron Man. I do not think the Ravonna stuff is the problem. That said, I do think she should probably get a nerf. Like, there's no reason why she shouldn't be 2-1 or 2-2 at this point. I think it'd be very reasonable to take the power off of it. But if we're being realistic, I think that the Mockingbird stuff is just a much larger issue with this deck. The fact that it gets to run this Athena, Angela, amazing cards core, Mockingbird discounting for free, just a bunch of ridiculous things are happening, and that's what's really good about this shell. Ravonna helps, don't get me wrong. She's a great package to include because Sage and Iron Man are so good. But there's just kind of a lot going on in this deck, and I don't think it's fair to isolate it to one card individually, unless that card is Mockingbird. So, in keeping with what we discussed about showing variations of the shell, this is a variation crafted by Shuri Enjoyer, and instead of using the Iron Man, there is a Shuri package in here alongside Hope. One thing that I noticed with this list is you generate an absolute berserk amount of energy. You have these very unique Shuri into big guy into Taskmaster situations that not a lot of people are really expecting. It's a solid option if you don't want to play the stock version of the Ravonna list, but I'm not sure it's actually all that much better. It really just looks like something that's like maybe going for a bit of surprise value instead of just straight up power. And there's nothing wrong with that per se, but I do think that all else held equal, I would recommend the original list. It's just important to show you what else you can do in the shell. Because of the list we just discussed, the Ravonna, Mockingbird, Sasquatch, all that stuff is sort of the kind of stuff that makes you have to run Mobius. So we're going to start talking about some Mobius decks now. And the first, and I think probably best of them, is Pixie Anni. But there is some general confusion as to like what the best list is. This is the one that I'm playing. I think it's probably at most one card off. And that one card that it might be off is Alioth. Alioth won me a lot of games that no other card would, but was also very clunky in a lot of games where I might have just been happier if I'd had a better curve earlier, right? I think with Alioth, evaluating him is pretty tough because of how much he wins you totally unwinnable games, but I could see cutting him for like a White Widow or something and being very happy about that decision. Maybe a Nocturne, something like that, right? That is something that I can see happening very easily. because Alioth is this high impact card. You remember when you scam someone with him, and maybe you remember a little bit less when your White Widow is just sort of generically good and you wouldn't have drawn a 2-drop otherwise, and it allows you to play more cards in the actual game, and taking game actions is good, right? That said, this deck is taking a fairly aggressive stance aimed at being a Mobius deck, and I think that is just going to be a through line that you're going to see. The pressure the Ravonna deck puts on the metagame, or really any deck with Mockingbird puts on the metagame, if you see someone playing Mysterio Mockingbird, you gotta get that guy down. You gotta get that Mobius down. And better players will play out their, their Mockingbirds much earlier. It does feel like so much of the game right now revolves around having Mysterio, having Mockingbird. Does your opponent have Mobius? That's so much of it because it is so ridiculous when it works. It's just so far above rate. And then when it doesn't work, it's not very good. And that is what this deck is aiming at. Now, obviously, if we're going to be a Mobius deck, we're going to take aim by being a Pixie deck, right? You usually, when you are playing Mobius, you want to find some other way to make Mobius something other than a stone 3/3. Pixie is this deck's way of doing it. Playing Pixie and then playing Mobius removes the downside of Pixie and gives you some potential real incredible high rolls, and that is a powerful thing to do. One other thing I wanted to note is that I have gone back and forth on Squirrel Girl versus Mysterio in this list, and frankly, I think it could go either way. Now, the major thing that Mysterio has over Squirrel Girl is that it's better to evolve Cersei and you get one more discount on your Mockingbird. However, Squirrel Girl does cost 1, which enables you to play her later, and also if she's in the deck, you have more 1-drops when you play Pixie. I think it's close to a wash. I've opted for Mysterio because of a noted increase in Killmongers that I've been playing against, but really, I think it's just a little bit, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other when it comes to that choice. And so you can make whichever one that you choose. This is my current build of Silver Surfer, and it's a fairly straightforward build that looks to roll downhill with Brood Abs, supplemented by Mockingbird. I know you're going to say, KM, do I need to play Phastos? You don't need to play Phastos, could very easily be Gladiator. The same actually goes of basically any card you don't have. You could replace it with Gladiator, or Sebastian Shaw, or whatever it is you actually want to be playing in here, you can happily do that. I have no real opinion on taking out the 11th and 12th cards in this deck and putting in Sebastian Shaw Gladiator because you want more beef. Maybe that's a better thing to do than what I'm doing. I'm not entirely sure. The point is, Silver Surfer itself is what's worth talking about here. Silver Surfer, we just discussed how important Mobius was because everything is trying to do something unfair with a Mockingbird. The things that are not trying to do something unfair with a Mockingbird are mostly Zoo decks, against which Killmonger is absolutely invaluable. Surfer's ability to run Mobius and Killmonger has made it a better deck than it basically ever has been in a very long time. Silver Surfer is an extremely well-positioned deck. I think it ends up a little bit lower on any given tier list than the other decks we've talked about, the Ravonna deck, the Pixie deck, but it is probably the most easy to pick up and play. If you are an average player, Silver Surfer is going to be your life raft. This should be the deck that if you're like, I have no idea what to do, I have not been paying attention, play Silver Surfer. It's honestly very easy to play. You have a lot of answers. The deck is well positioned right now, and your answers are like pretty obvious when you're supposed to do them. When it comes to how the deck plays out, Plan A is playing Brood into Absorbing Man. Plan B is playing Hope into whatever, into an Absorbing Man Silver Surfer on the final turn of the game. One real quick play note I have for you is you should almost never be running out your Nova on the first few turns of the game. A lot of people are running Red Guardian, it'll die for nothing, but B, you kind of want to keep it for your Hope Summers lane later in the game so you can get that energy. You are almost never going to be able to put a turn together where you are not going to be able to play Nova on turn 5 and on turn 6. It can happen, but it's very, very rare. And so for that reason, it's very unfortunate to just run it out there, be like, oh, it's fine, I don't need to worry about that, everything's gonna be fine, because sometimes it won't be fine. Like, there are some scenarios where this is like a real thing you have to worry about. Like, it's not always the like you sometimes you get Mobius and you need to play your Mockingbird for 5, and then you're like, oh man, I really wish I'd played that Nova, right? Like, if you think that's a possibility, think about it. But general default, don't run your Nova out there willy-nilly. I also had a decent amount of success with this NoBird Surfer list, and I kinda get it, right? Since there is so much Mobius running around, you're gonna run into a lot of people playing Mobius and Surfer, a lot of people playing Mobius and Pixie. It becomes a little bit less profitable to invest in Mockingbird when you're already winning those games where you're playing something like Brood Abs anyway, and that's how you get your Mockingbird cheap anyway, and it's just like, okay, it might not be really worth it in the context of this metagame. And if you find that it's not all that worth it, this is a valid and viable list. One card that I really want to highlight in here is Cosmo, who is totally worthless right up until he's not. Like, this is a card that is sometimes the only card that's ever going to win you a game, but also in every other game you play, he's like, there's the worst card ever. And so you end up in this situation where, like, I actually draw an analogy from this Cosmo to the Alioth and the Pixie deck, where I'm like, I feel like there's gotta be something better here, right? Like, maybe a Red Guardian, maybe a Gladiator, I don't know, but there's just gotta be something that is on average better. However, it is nice to have that sort of snap with impunity into various Wong stuff, right? Like, you're gonna get free wins out of running Cosmo. I don't know if it's a long-term strategy, but again, when you look at this deck, like, look at how much tech you have, right? You have Cosmo for on-reveal decks. You have Killmonger for one-drop decks. You have Nocturne for limbo decks. You have so much, and I didn't even mention Mobius. Like, everything in your deck deals with a different problem in the metagame. There's so much, right? And so I get it. Like, I get what this deck is going for. I really do. Speaking of on-reveal decks that get worked by Cosmo, this was actually a very successful list for me, and it feels like it's fallen under the radar in a way that it probably shouldn't. The Namora Wong deck is honestly quite solid at outputting a large volume of points in ways that are disruptible, but not overly so. Like, yeah, you can get disrupted, you can run into weird situations, you can get your guys Cosmo to Red Guardian or whatever, but you can also play around a lot of that. You have an Echo, which can prevent your stuff from getting Cosmo'd. You can put an Ironheart in your Wong lane so it doesn't get Red Guardian. Like, there's stuff you can do to deal with the common tech cards that you're going to see. And because you are not vulnerable to the even more common tech cards, cards like Mobius, cards like Killmonger, you don't really care about them. You're a Ravonna deck, but she's kind of just there. Like, you're really not getting a whole lot out of her. She's just there. She exists. And if she gets obliterated or Mobius or whatever, you're fine. You can just, like, Wong combo off. The output here when you do your Wong combo is very high. The risk that this deck has is that it's also very telegraphed. So usually your opponents are going to be able to math out what's going on and then either leave if they're losing or stay and take your cubes if they're winning. Now, the upshot is your plan is very, very strong. There are not a lot of situations that people can put in that actually make you lose, but it is a reasonable issue to consider. I think this is a very good deck, an underrated one, and one that is absolutely still worth playing. Here's where I'm at with Zoo right now. As you can clearly see from everything we've talked about, Killmonger is a fairly prominent card, as is Mobius. So that means that, unfortunately, I think Zoo's tech is sort of dictated to it rather than actually being what it wants to be. This is a metagame where Zoo is forced to adapt rather than the alternative. Zoo has to be playing Mobius or it doesn't have the power output that the decks that can play Ravonna and Iron Man do. Zoo has to be playing Kyera or you're gonna get Killmongered by every single Surfer deck and also several others. Zoo has to be playing Snowguard because you don't have any other way to deal with Doc Ock decks that are going to be playing Limbo. You're very bad into decks that are clogging you on purpose. And so you end up in these situations where the deck is almost dictated to you. You have your 9-card core, and then I just really can't find any justification to run any choices in the tech slot other than those 3. Like, normally you have a lot of flexibility. Let me take and customize what I want to do with this deck. Right now, I feel like the metagame is telling you this is what you have to do. You have no choice. Speaking of dock and pray, if you hate yourself and want your opponent to feel the same thing, I think this is a great choice for whatever it is that you want to do. Dock and pray is just a very, very odious archetype, in my humble opinion. All you're really doing is play magic, hope it doesn't get blown up. Play Dock-Ock, hope it actually works. That's it. That's the deck. And so it is an absolute mastermind of 2-cube wins. Like this is basically the Galactus of the metagame, where it's like you're gonna win some games, you're gonna win a lot of games, but like, oh my god, they are gonna be excruciatingly long. Your opponents are gonna be retreating for one very often because they know what you're doing, they know what's going on. You have like the lane locked. It's not like you're surprising them or anything like that. There's no surprise in this deck at all. You usually win at most 2 cubes, and then you can really get robbed if they manage to, like, turn the tables on your limbo or something like that. The mill stuff here is fine. I think one underrated aspect of this deck is that you don't really need the mill stuff, but it's good enough to run just because it's good points, right? Like, this is a deck that is very comfortable just being like, hey, check out my points. I've got some points here. I need those, right? And like the mill stuff isn't awful at that. It's really not. That said, it's a pretty iffy choice if you ask me. I didn't have a lot of fun playing it. I don't think my opponents had a lot of fun playing against it. I very rarely have a lot of fun playing this deck. So if you're someone who loves asymmetric fun, you love having all the fun, you want your opponent to have none, this is probably the best deck in the game at making sure your opponent has absolutely no fun at all. This is basically the same deck, but like a different flavor. Instead of using the mill sub-theme, it's like a more direct clog sub-theme. If I had to guess, I would say this one is baseline stronger because there are more obvious early snaps, things like Titania Goblin Clogs, right? Like, when you have early snaps in your deck, you're going to be able to get slightly higher cube equity. Like, they're still going to be retreating for 2, but you don't end up putting yourself in situations where you have to be like, well, I can't snap until I see what the Dock-Ock pulls down. I really don't want to snap the Dock-Ock because what if it's absolutely awful, right? This deck has ways of winning that aren't just dock and pray. There are powerful clog strategies at play in this list, and I would be remiss if I said that it wasn't doing stuff that was actually strong. I personally think this one is a little bit better, a little bit more interesting, but it is also way harder to play. It is very difficult to play a deck like this. I really cannot stress that enough. I struggle with it greatly. I am not good at playing Titania decks. I am just not good at it. And I'm a very good card game player. Like, not to toot my own horn, but if I'm telling you that this is a problematic and difficult deck to play, it really is. Like, this is hard for me to manage, and I would imagine it's hard for others to manage as well. I genuinely can't believe I'm saying this. I really, truly, genuinely can't believe I'm saying this, but I think the best Loki deck right now is Phoenix Force Loki. I understand that is a ridiculous sentence. It is just an absolute abomination of nature. For those who are not familiar with Phoenix Force Loki, it's a deck that I believe Get Wrecked cooked up a few months ago and ended up playing in the Johnson Cup, a tournament series. And it has recently been revived in the hands of KX4N and several other people who are just sort of like generally like high elo memers, I guess. But I think they really stumbled onto something. So when we're going to talk about why Loki is bad, that's actually pretty straightforward. Everybody's playing Mobius, so you don't really want to be a Loki deck right now. You would much rather be basically anything else. I kind of got nowhere playing Loki, and I was not alone in that. Several other people who are normally people who want to play Loki kind of got nowhere as well, and Mobius is only really picking up in terms of Steam. And when you're playing against a field of like Pixie Mobius, which beats you, Silver Surfer, which has Mobius, which beats you, and then the Ravonna deck where it's like, yeah, Loki's good into that, but like not necessarily always winning. They can beat you just on numbers too because of all the early scalers they have. It's hard to find a Loki that makes sense. So what's happening here is you are a Phoenix Force deck that also sometimes has a YOLO Loki plan, right? And Phoenix Force is actually just as good as you remember it being when you do that. Snap every time you have it. That's just how you play the deck. When you have the combo, you have a multiple man that's going to die, and you have a Phoenix Force, you snap it, you go nuts. In matchups where Loki is good, you can try snapping that too. Like, this is a real thing that you're going to try to do. Effectively, this is just two cheeseball strategies jammed together, and what you're trying to do is just look for as many free wins as you possibly can get. It's powerful, legitimately. Last I checked, it had like a 700 game sample size on Untapped and like a 55% win rate, which is crazy. It's a Phoenix Force deck. Ridiculous, right? I think that I hate having to say this, but if I had to play Loki, I'd probably play this version. We're getting into, I would say, like mid tier 2 here, where these are decks that I think if you understand why the decks we previously talked about are good, you can understand why these ones tend to struggle. This deck, I mean, look at it, right? You die to Mobius. That's why you run Rogue. If you don't Rogue their Mobius, you die. That's basically it. That's the deck, right? The whole point of this deck is to discount as many big idiots as you possibly can, and then play as many big idiots as you possibly can. And then hopefully that is just enough points that your opponents just absolutely roll over and die. If they play Mobius, you kind of cry. If you can, you rogue it. If you can't, you die. That's this deck. That is what Deathbird has become. You can play Hela if you want. I think that Hela's major issue right now is that post-nerf, it actually genuinely is liable to just get outpointed by your average Iron Man deck. Like, the kind of power that a Ravonna, Athena, Iron Man, Sasquatch kind of deck can bring to bear is actually kind of comparable to what this deck can do. And because of that, if you're not discarding the Infinite, you kind of end up very much in range of losing to those decks. You do have this like Infinite Black Knight kind of thing that you can get on the board. That's fine. Like, it's not the wrong thing to do. It's just like, you're kind of running out of Black Knight. What if it gets Red Guardian? What if it gets Killmonger? There's kind of a lot that like can go wrong in this deck. And Hela has always been predicated on guaranteed wins against the mid-range decks, right? The decks that don't really have any ability to interact with it, and Hela just gets to go taller. And those wins are not really guaranteed anymore because going taller is no longer guaranteed. I think we knew we'd get around to talking about Destroy at some point with all the praises I've sung of Killmonger. I think at this point, this is a very well-worn archetype. Everyone kind of knows what it is and what it does. And the only thing that we need to talk about is what to do with that one tech slot. To me, it's a competition between Lady Deathstrike and Arnim Zola. Arnim Zola allows you to do really stupid stuff. No arguments from me. Lady Deathstrike lets you kill your opponent's Mobius. Those are really the choices that you have right now. Those are the options that you're going to want to put into your deck here. You're going to want to either kill your opponent's Mobius or do something stupid like null Zola or whatever, right? That's kind of the range you're looking at for Destroy. I think basically everything else is just, that's what the deck looks like. Those are the 11 cards that go in the deck, and then you mess around with your one tech slot. It's a good deck. It's definitely not bad. But I think it ends up in this situation where it ends up being a little bit reliant on like specific things in order to be unpredictable. And it is, on the other hand, an absolutely immensely powerful deck on the right locations. There's a lot of like location snaps in this deck that you should really keep your eye on. Stuff like Shuri's Lab, if your opponent isn't playing Kitty, it's going to be ridiculous for you. Stuff like Sinister London is usually pretty ridiculous for you, unless you get White Widowed. But yeah, there's a lot of good locations for this deck. Cloning Vats comes to mind as well. Just good stuff can happen here for sure. If you want to just like play an easy, reasonable deck, Sandman is around for you. I think it's like a little bit, if maybe significantly worse than it previously was, because of the general amount of power output in the metagame right now. It's hard for you to catch up with something like a Shuri Enjoyer off a Pixie, or something like even Silver Surfer. If Silver Surfer plays Brood Abs into you, you're probably going to die, even if you prevent their final turn from involving 2 cards. Like, Sandman is a fairly predictable archetype, and right now the early game power of the meta is such that it's kind of hard to get ahead unless you're doing something legitimately unfair in the early game, and this deck isn't doing anything all that unfair. It's like a little unfair, but it's mostly just good cards and then Makari. Another alteration of the Sandman style of list. This is, of course, the ElecBlink Circe list. Again, playable, nothing wrong with it, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it as highly as basically everything we've already talked about. It is absolutely serviceable, it is perfectly fine. This is a solid, straightforward deck that is looking to play Electro and then turn that Electro into upside. But I think that's a little bit more pie in the sky than it might sound like. Yes, you have a lot of ways of doing that, but you have very few ways of actually capitalizing on it. The actual value you're getting is usually you're getting a blink or you're getting a Circe, right? And then like your turn 4 being a 5-drop like that can put you ahead on tempo in a really valuable way. We just talked about how you need to be doing unfair stuff if you were going to be trying to Sandman people. But then, like, your turn 5 is a 6-drop, and your turn 6 is a 6-drop, and, like, you're not really getting anything out of getting rid of the Electro. You're getting it out of, like, what the Electro turns into. That's where the value comes out here, and that's the, like, reason you'd play this deck over the other Sandman deck, is you're like, I want to be doing something more unfair in the early game that is also a little bit harder to guarantee will happen. Tanjo cooked this up, and it's fine. It strikes me as like a little bit difficult to manage against decks that put power on the board early. There's some real, like, there's something going on here that I actually do like. Professor X and all the movers is like vaguely compelling to me, but the rest of it is just like fundamentally we're pretty low power. So if we're not playing a workable Miss Marvel, we really struggle to catch up on numbers to other decks, even if we're Professor Xing. I think that Miss Marvel's probably the most important card in this deck. Like, as she goes, so go your matchups, because of just how incredible she is in the context of Professor X, just how absolutely amazing she is when you're locking stuff down. She's a fine choice. Like, this is a fine, reasonable choice, but I feel like it's just a little bit lower power than several other options that you could be playing instead, and requires a lot of sort of finicky maneuvering and guessing and close games. And also, I think you're like mostly dead to Zoo. I think you're like nearly 100% dead to Zoo unless you totally catch them off guard. Honorable mention to Roram Strong Guy. This is a discard surfer list that I think relies a lot on people not knowing what's going on. It certainly does against me. It's very powerful, but also a little bit, I think on balance, the other surfer lists are better, but this one has the advantage of A, having Strong Guy, shout out to Strong Guy, and B, having Gambit, shout out to Gambit, and C, being just weird and unpredictable. And when you have something that is generally a good strategy, that is also just like including some incredibly unexpected elements, US Agent, Proxima Midnight, like nobody really plays around that stuff. And so you can set up situations where your opponent has absolutely no read on what your range is, because why would they? Issues, however, no Mobius, no Killmonger. So a lot of the reason to play Silver Surfer is that you get to run those cards for free. This deck gets rid of them, and so it ends up being less, not benefiting from the well-positionedness of being a Surfer deck, because so much of that deck being well-positioned is Mobius and Killmonger. And I think especially when I played against this deck, I didn't know it wasn't running that stuff, so I was afraid of Killmonger the whole time, right? And if you know that, it's a little bit easier to play against, isn't it? Finally, we have the Marvel Snap equivalent of Wallet Warrior. This is just like a bunch of Series 5 cards, and they're all in a deck. Yeah, that's what's happening here. It's sort of the Noki-less Noki that we talked about previously on this channel, or I guess a cousin of the Ravonna deck, where it's just like, look, we're going to run a bunch of really good cards, and we're not going to have this Mockingbird stuff. We're not going to do any of that. We're just going to play small ball here. It's viable because people are hard targeting Mockingbird stuff so much, and so when you run into a Mobius, this deck kind of turns it into nothing, right? Like, oh, that's just a 3/3. I don't really care about it. I'm good, right? And because of that, there's some real upside here, but it's very much, to me, a little bit of a meta call where you're just saying, instead of being a Ravonna Sasquatch deck, I'm going to give up on that power because everyone's playing Mobius, and I'm just going to play a deck that doesn't get blanked by Mobius. So it's very much a metagame call. Nothing wrong with that, just something to consider. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for making it through that video. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. I hope you enjoyed the KM Boost, and I'll see you in the next one.